On tonight's episode of Cooking with Crime, we'll be discussing Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. Gary was born on February 18th, 1949, in Salt Lake City. He was the middle of three boys. There's really no information on the first 12 years of his life, except he was a bedwetter and his mother would aggressively wash his genitalia. Gary had the serial killer triad: bedwetting, fire starting, and animal cruelty. In 1960, when Gary was 12 years old, he moved to SeaTac, a town in Seattle. His address was 4404 South 105th Street, where he lived in a 600-foot square house where him and his brother shared a single bedroom. Neighbor kids would say he was pretty normal. His best friend would say that he would never have suspected him as a serial killer, that there was absolutely no signs whatsoever. When Gary was 16, he asked a first grader to play with him. He then stabbed the kid and punctured the kid's liver. The kid asked, "Why would you do that?" And Gary simply just said, "I don't know, I just wanted to see what it felt like." The kid would survive and later testify. At this point, Gary's father would work at a funeral home. Gary overheard his dad talking to other adults, and a coworker liked to engage in acts of necrophilia. Now Gary has weird fantasies of the women not being able to fill it, I guess. I don't know. Gary would also fantasize about stabbing his mother in the chest and cutting up her face. He'd tell prosecutors he was attracted to his mom, which humiliated him, which then brought feelings of hate towards his mom. His mom also dressed like a prostitute on a daily basis. On August 18th, 1969, Gary enlisted in the Navy. He would serve in Vietnam. Gary was stationed in the Philippines. During his time in the Philippines, he'd hire sex workers and not use protection. He would later get diagnosed with gonorrhea and took it out on the sex workers. On August 15th, 1970, he would marry and move to San Francisco. In 1971, Gary was discharged from the Navy, and in 1972, Gary and his wife would divorce because his wife would get caught cheating on him. Gary would return to SeaTac, where he would be working at Kenworth for 30 years, where he painted semi-trucks. His coworkers would say he was a perfectly normal guy, considered him a steady Eddie, and was extremely level-headed. He'd wear jeans and a plaid button-up, he combed his hair back, and was extremely particular about his appearance. They'd also describe him as over-the-top friendly, like creepy friendly. Women at work would say different, though. They'd go on to say that they felt extremely uncomfortable around Gary. He'd go up to women and rub their shoulders and comment on their appearance. Gary got married again in 1979 to the mother of his child, Matthew Ridgway, born in 1975. Matthew never suspected his dad as a serial killer. Gary was always there for his son. He always showed up. Every school function, Gary was there. They spent the weekends garage selling, they went camping, played baseball, even rode motorcycles together. Gary would get divorced in 1980, and she would even put a restraining order on him. His wife would later say he was really into bondage. He'd come up behind her and scare her in the middle of the woods. He even choked her once from behind in their driveway. He became fanatical about religion, going door to door preaching, and when the neighbors didn't want to hear about it, he'd get infuriated, doing all this, all while purchasing prostitutes behind his wife's back. After the divorce, Gary would have thoughts about killing his ex-wife and his son. Gary purchased a house, and later he'd claim he killed dozens of women in his house on his bed. And in 1982, women began disappearing or found dead in King County, Washington. The first 5 women were found in the Green River, and that's how he got his name, the Green River Killer. He'd bring his victims home, strangle them, then dispose of them in wooded areas. In May 1982, he got arrested for solicitation after approaching an undercover officer. The killings have been happening for 2 months now. On July 15th, 1982, 2 teenagers found a body in the river. Over the next few weeks, 4 more women were found. 3 more bodies found on August 16th, all off the SeaTac Strip. On August 16th, they established the Green River Task Force. It takes a task force 20 years to arrest Ridgway, but in the next 2 years, there will be 40 more murders. Ridgway actually became a suspect in 1983 when an 18-year-old became missing after her boyfriend watched her get into a truck with patches. The boyfriend waited 4 days before reporting her missing. He later claimed he was looking for her when he spotted the truck she was last seen in. On May 4th, police spoke to Ridgway. He denied seeing or knowing the missing woman. In November of 1983, police spoke to Ridgway again and denied knowing anything about the Green River Killer. Oh yeah, when police questioned Ridgway about the missing 18-year-old girl, he was actually standing against his fence to hide the scratches. When police left, he burned his scratches off with battery acid to disguise them, then buried her body right after he got done talking to the police. In May 1984, he actually offered his assistance in finding the Green River Killer. Ridgway also passed 2 polygraph tests, one in 1984 and again in 1986. He'd later say he just relaxed and answered the questions. A victim finally comes forward. She'd go on to say that he brought her into the woods, attacked her, and she put up a huge fight, ran to the nearest trailer. She didn't come forward for a year because she was afraid of getting in trouble for prostitution. She'd also admit she'd seen his ID on the night of the attack. Ridgway is now on police radar. In 1987, Ridgway met his 3rd wife, married in 1988. She'd later say that he treated her really well, but his neighbors started suspecting him as the Green River Killer. He would then move into a new home. His new neighbors would say he was kind of weird, but they got used to him. They'd see him out gardening, they'd be walking their pet poodle, or he was just a normal family man. In 1986, lead detective spoke to Ted Bundy. Bundy wrote the detective offering his assistance, so he flew to Florida to meet with Bundy. Bundy informed him that he might be revisiting his locations where he dumped his bodies. Now police are on his tail, but they know they need more evidence to nail him, so they start following him around. They notice he purchases way more gas during the weeks women come up missing. With this information, police were able to obtain a search warrant, and because he was also seen with 2 of the victims. At this point, Ridgway would provide police with a saliva sample, but there's 48 murders at this time. 48 murders! Everyone at work now is suspecting Ridgway as the Green River Killer, but they never mention it. They just secretly gave him nicknames, like Green River Gary or GR. By the 1990s, police had a few other suspects, but Ridgway was still on the list. March 2001, detectives used new DNA tech to re-examine the case, including his preserved saliva sample from 1987. 14 years has passed. They found sperm on 3 of the victims, and they tested the DNA, and bam, it was a match. It was Gary Ridgway. Police started searching Highway 99, aka Pacific Avenue South. On November 16, 2001, Ridgway stopped at a hotel, waved cash out the window at a prostitute. She came over and asked if he wanted a room. He said no, there's an officer around the corner, and asked if they could meet at the bank. The woman was an undercover officer and signaled for police to arrest Ridgway. He was sentenced to 90 days in jail. His sentence and fines were suspended on the condition he stayed out of trouble for 2 years and stayed away from areas with sex workers. By the time of his arrest, 42 of the 49 victims were found. They obtained 10,000 items of evidence with DNA on them. On November 30th, 2001, police arrived at Kenworth and arrested Ridgway on suspicion of 4 murders. He was 52 years old. November 5th, 2003, Ridgway pled guilty to 48 of the 49 murders. He took a plea bargain to avoid the death penalty, but in 2011, they found the 49th victim and added another life sentence. On December 18th, 2003, Gary Ridgway was convicted of 48 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. During interviews, Ridgway was extremely honest. He'd go on to tell detectives that he preferred to strangle because using weapons would be too messy, and strangling is more personal and rewarding. He admitted to revisiting the sites till the flies came. He performed acts of necrophilia on 10 victims. When asked why he just didn't buy a new one, he'd say, well, for one thing, you'd have to pay for it, and she's already dead. He later go on to say that he never took trophies, but took jewelry to put in women's bathroom. He got off on thinking someone walking around with that jewelry they found in the bathroom. He talked about how he avoided capture. He said he always wore gloves, he left behind gum wrappers and cigarette butts when he never smoked or chewed gum. If he injured himself, he'd file for workers' comp, he'd clip the nails of his victims, and he just never talked about the murders. For 20 years, he never talked about the murders. During the pandemic, Ridgway was 1 in 12,000 inmates to be released. The prison would argue they could not provide safe conditions during the pandemic. It was denied, but if it had been passed, inmates over the age of 50 or with underlying health conditions would have been released. Today, Ridgway sits in the Walla Walla State Prison, waiting to die behind bars. He is now 74 years old.